she dismissed him in front of 11 people, a conference table full of investors, and a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the river. Anneliese Croft did it quietly, which was somehow worse than if she'd made a scene. She looked at the man standing near the doorway, plain jacket, work boots, a paper cup of coffee from the cart downstairs, and she said, "This session is closed." 44 minutes later, the deal she'd spent 4 months building walked out with him. And the worst part, the part she'd replay at 2 in the morning for weeks afterward, was that she never even asked his name. The morning had started the way important mornings always did for Anneliese, too early, too quiet, and dressed up to look manageable. She was out of bed by 5:15, which wasn't unusual. She'd been running Croft Capital Group for 3 years. She'd taken the chair at 32 when the previous CEO retired abruptly, and the board decided, with what she suspected was reluctant consensus, that promoting from inside was less disruptive than a national search. She hadn't asked for the title. She'd been COO for 18 months, and she'd been good at it precisely because she understood that the COO's job was to make the CEO look right. Then suddenly she was the CEO, and there was no one left to make look right except herself. She stood at her kitchen window with black coffee and a yellow legal pad she'd been using to outline the day, and she watched the city come awake below her apartment. The delivery trucks, the early joggers. The particular quality of morning light that happened in October when the angle dropped and everything looked briefly like a painting before the day got ordinary again. The Ashby Group partnership. That was today. She'd said the name so many times in the past 6 weeks that it had stopped sounding like a company and started sounding like something she owed money to. Which, in a sense, she did. Without a significant capital partner before the fiscal year turned, Croft Capital would spend the next 18 months in a slow, painful squeeze, not failing exactly, but contracting, shrinking, becoming the kind of firm that other firms referenced in past tense. Her CFO, Renata Cho, had laid it out plainly in September. The Ashby Group was the opportunity. A mid-sized private equity firm with a 20-year track record and the kind of reputation that existed mostly through word of mouth among people who measured success in decades rather than quarters. Their principal, a man named Jonah Ashby, didn't do conference panels. He didn't have a media presence. What he had was a list of portfolio companies that had performed, without exception, and a standing in the industry that operated almost entirely on trust earned slowly over time. Anneliese had spent 6 weeks preparing for this meeting. She'd rebuilt the pitch deck twice. She'd had Renata run 3 separate scenario models. She'd personally reviewed every slide, every footnote, every projected number until she could recite them in her sleep, and had twice, waking up at 3 in the morning with a financial projection running through her head like a song she couldn't shake. The meeting was at 10. She was in the office by 7:30. Her assistant, Penn, was already there, which was never a surprise. Penn was 27 and operated with the focused efficiency of someone who'd decided early that competence was the most reliable form of job security. He was standing at his desk with a tablet, looking at it with the expression he wore when something was slightly wrong, but not catastrophically so. "Good morning," Anneliese said. "What is it?" "AV Setup is having a moment," Penn said. And the Ashby Group confirmed 2 attendees, but their office sent over 3 names, 3. Their analyst, a woman named Kate Drummond, their legal liaison, a Mr. Ferris, and the principal himself. He looked up. "No photo on file for Mr. Ashby. His office doesn't circulate one." Anneliese set her bag down. "That's unusual." Their assistant said it's intentional. He prefers to arrive without advance context. Penn paused. "Whatever that means." She thought about it for a moment, then moved on. There were 11 other things to handle before 10. The prep meeting ran from 8:30 to 9:40. The conference room on the 14th floor was full. Renata at the head, 2 senior analysts with laptops, the communications director, and 2 members of the legal team who'd spent the past 2 weeks reviewing the term sheet. They ran the pitch clean. It was tight. The numbers held up under every angle Renata threw at them. Anneliese answered every hypothetical without hesitating. "You're ready," Renata said when they finished. Anneliese nodded. She didn't say what she was actually thinking, which was that she'd been ready for 3 weeks, and what she needed now was for the meeting to simply exist and end correctly. The main conference room on 15 was the building's best space, wide windows on the east side, a table that sat 16, the river visible in the distance on clear days. Today was clear. She arrived at 9:45 and checked the presentation on the main screen, adjusted 2 of the chairs, and drank half a glass of water while her team filtered in. The Ashby Group's team was expected at 10 sharp. At 9:58, the conference room door opened. Anneliese was in conversation with Renata when it happened. She registered the shift in the room first, that particular recalibration when someone unexpected enters. and turned to see a man she didn't recognize standing near the door. He looked to be in his mid to late 30s. He wasn't tall in a way that commanded space, but there was something in how he stood, completely still, without the self-conscious awareness of someone who knew they'd entered a room full of strangers, that drew the eye. He was wearing dark pants and a plain jacket, no tie. Work boots, she noticed, the kind with the reinforced toe. He was holding a paper coffee cup from the cart in the building lobby, the small one. He was looking at the river through the east windows with the mild, unhurried interest of someone who had nowhere else to be. One of her junior coordinators, a young man named Scott, appeared at the man's elbow. "Can I help you?" The man turned. He had an even, unhurried face. Not blank, just unrushed. "I'm fine," he said. "Thanks. This is a closed session," Scott said, with the particular confidence of someone who'd been assigned to guard a room and was taking the assignment seriously. "Are you with the catering setup?" Something moved in the man's expression. Not offense, more like a private notation being made. "No," he said. "I'm not. Do you have a badge? A confirmation from our office?" "I don't have a badge." Scott straightened. "Then I'll need to ask you to wait in reception until—" Scott. Anneliese had crossed the room, moving to intervene, mostly because the 10 o'clock was 3 minutes away and she needed everything to be in order. She looked at the man and felt something she couldn't immediately place, a faint sense of recognition without a source, the way a piece of music sounds before you remember where you heard it. "I'm sorry," she said, using the voice she'd spent years building for rooms like this, efficient, measured, authoritative. "This meeting is for confirmed guests only. If you're with the Ashby group, you should have a confirmation. If someone from your office could call." "He's confirmed," said a voice from the doorway. Anneliese turned. A woman in her 40s had appeared, sharp suit, leather folder, the expression of someone watching a small disaster assemble itself in slow motion. This was Kate Drummond. Anneliese recognized her from the LinkedIn profile Penn had pulled. She was looking at the man in the plain jacket with an expression Anneliese couldn't entirely read. "He's confirmed," Kate said again. Her voice was controlled and very carefully neutral. "Then he's welcome to." Scott started. "Scott." The voice came from the far end of the table. Anneliese's board liaison, a man named Jeffrey, said it without looking up from his phone. "Handle it." And Scott handled it the way a 25-year-old who'd been told to handle something handles it, with complete commitment to the instruction and no curiosity whatsoever about whether the instruction was correct. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step out to reception. You can wait there until we've verified." The man looked down at Scott's hand on his arm. Then he looked at Anneliese. She was already looking elsewhere. Renata was trying to get her attention. The clock on the wall said 9:59. She turned away. She turned away. She heard the door. She heard the slight shuffle of movement, the quiet mechanical click of the latch catching. She looked at Kate Drummond, who was standing in the doorway with an expression that was, Anneliese would understand later, the expression of someone deciding whether to say the thing they were actually thinking. Kate decided not to. She walked to her seat, set her folder on the table, and didn't say another word. The meeting started on time. Anneliese presented well. She always presented well. She'd been doing this long enough that she could run the pitch on a kind of professional autopilot, while a part of her brain ran the numbers separately, checking and rechecking. She walked through the portfolio structure, the 3-year projection, the strategic rationale for the partnership. She answered Kate's 2 questions with precision. Jonah Ashby's empty seat sat at the corner of the table and didn't move. Nobody mentioned it directly. That was the particular skill of rooms like this. You arranged yourself around the thing that wasn't there and discussed everything else. At 10:49, Anneliese's phone buzzed under the table. She ignored it. At 10:52, it buzzed again. At 10:55, Penn opened the conference room door and caught her eye with a look that said, "Now." She wrapped the presentation in 2 minutes of closing remarks she could have said in her sleep, called a brief break, and was in the hallway before the door finished closing. Penn was 2 steps away, holding his phone like it was something he'd rather not be holding. "Read this," he said. It was an email from the Ashby Group's office. 4 sentences. The first said that the Ashby Group was withdrawing from all discussions regarding a potential partnership with Croft Capital Group, effective immediately. The second said the decision was final. The third said further inquiries should be directed to their legal team. The fourth said they wished Croft Capital success in its future endeavors. Anneliese read it twice. She was aware of her own breathing, deliberate, controlled, the way you breathe when you don't want the hallway to see what's happening inside you. "When did this come in?" 10:44, Penn said. 5 minutes ago. 44 minutes since the meeting started. 44 minutes since the man in the work boots had been walked to the door with his paper coffee cup. Penn? Yeah. What does Jonah Ashby look like? Penn looked at her. He didn't speak for a moment. Then he took his phone back, scrolled, and handed it over. It was a photograph from a regional business profile. Plain background, professional, almost aggressively ordinary. A man in his mid to late 30s with an even face and dark eyes. The same eyes. Anneliese handed the phone back. She stood in the hallway outside a conference room where 14 people were waiting, and the river glittered through the east windows, and she said nothing for a long moment. I need 5 minutes, she said. She went to the women's restroom at the end of the hall. She ran cold water over her wrists. An old trick her mother had taught her, something about cold water grounding you, pulling you back into your body when your mind was trying to leave. She stood at the sink and looked at herself in the mirror. She'd rebuilt the pitch deck twice. She'd had Renata run 3 scenario models. She'd gotten the right coffee for the catering table, and she had walked the man they were meeting with out of her own conference room without asking his name. The face in the mirror had nothing reassuring to offer. She dried her hands. She went back in and told the room the meeting was concluded, that her office would be in touch, and that she thanked everyone for their time. She said it evenly. She didn't explain. After the room cleared, she sat alone at the conference table for 9 minutes. Jeffrey came back in. She didn't hear him approach. What happened? He asked. We lost it. He made a sound of surprise. Very good, very convincing. How? The presentation was solid. The presentation was fine. She looked at him. I need to think. He nodded slowly. He sat across from her and put his hands together on the table in the gesture of a man performing careful consideration, and said, Did something specific go wrong? With the pitch itself? No. Then it must be something they brought in with them. Sometimes these firms have internal dynamics. Jeffrey. She looked at him steadily. I need to think. He patted the table twice, an odd gesture she'd always found strange, that particular motion some men made on surfaces when they wanted to appear composed, and stood. Of course. We'll regroup. He paused at the door. This isn't over. We'll find another way. He left. She looked at Jonah Ashby's chair, still pulled at a slight angle from the table, because nobody had pushed it back in. We'll find another way. She didn't know yet why those 4 words made the back of her neck feel cold. She started digging that night. She'd always been good at research. Methodical, patient, willing to follow a thread further than most people thought was necessary. She pulled every piece of public information on Jonah Ashby herself, rather than assigning it to an analyst, because she didn't want this to become a story inside her company. What she found was more and less than she expected. He'd built the Ashby Group from almost nothing. A small fund started in his early 30s, a handful of investors who'd believed in him based on something that didn't fully show up in the public record. In 9 years, he'd grown it into one of the most consistently performing mid-size private equity firms in the country. Not the splashiest, not the one you saw on conference panels or in magazine profiles. But in terms of actual returns, actual decisions, actual outcomes for the companies he'd partnered with, exceptional. He had a daughter named Lily. She appeared in exactly one profile piece, a regional magazine article that he'd agreed to apparently because the publication donated proceeds to a children's literacy program. The writer had noted that he'd declined all interview requests for the prior 6 months. There was a quote near the end that Anneliese read twice. I've never been interested in being seen as important. I'm interested in making decisions that hold up. Those aren't the same thing, and a lot of people spend their careers never figuring that out. She put the article down. She went to the window and stood there with her arms crossed, looking at the city at 11:30 at night, thinking about a man who'd walked into her conference room in work boots with a paper coffee cup and let himself be shown the door. He'd been testing something. She just hadn't understood what was being tested until it was over. She called Kate Drummond at noon the next day. It rang 4 times before voicemail. She left a message, composed, professional, no trace of panic, saying she hoped to speak before end of week and would appreciate the opportunity to understand what had influenced the firm's decision. Kate called back 9 minutes later. Miss Croft, she said, by way of opening. Nothing else. Thank you for returning my call. I almost didn't. A pause. What happened yesterday was embarrassing. Not for Mr. Ashby. For your firm. I understand. Do you? Kate's voice wasn't unkind. It was the voice of someone who said what they meant without interest in softening it. From where I sat, the CEO of a firm asking for a significant capital partnership didn't recognize who she was meeting with, and when he was in the room, she let her staff manage him rather than taking 5 seconds to ask his name. Anneliese breathed evenly. That's accurate. He does this with every first meeting, Kate said after a moment. He arrives without announcement, no advance introduction from our side. He carries a coffee cup from whatever's downstairs. He wants to see how a room treats someone who doesn't look like money. Most rooms fail. A beat. Some rooms fail worse than others. Where did we land on that scale? Your junior coordinator was doing his job. The people around the table followed their environment. That's on the culture your firm has built, not on individual people. Another pause. What he saw was you, not Scott. He was watching you the whole time, watching to see what you would do when the situation was unclear. And you were already looking somewhere else. Anneliese stood very still. Outside her office window, a pigeon landed on the ledge, walked 3 steps, and flew away. Is there anything I can do? She said. Probably not. He doesn't reopen closed things as a rule. A pause. But I can tell you that this morning, the first he asked me was whether you called yourself or had someone call for you. Anneliese looked at her phone, her own name on the screen, the outgoing call. I called. I know, Kate said. I already told him that. 2 days later, Renata came to her office at 3 in the afternoon and closed the door. She only did this when the news was the kind that shouldn't travel through glass walls. I've been going through Westbrook, Renata said. Westbrook Capital Advisors had approached them the morning after the Ashby Group withdrew. Anneliese had noted the timing and filed it away as an unfortunate coincidence. She was beginning to reconsider that. Renata put a single handwritten page on the desk. Westbrook's primary backer, through 2 holding entities, is a group called Halloran Advisory Partners. Halloran was incorporated 22 months ago. She paused. Its registered agent is a law firm that also represents our board liaison, Jeffrey Strand. Anneliese looked at the paper. She looked at it for a long time. How sure are you? I spent 10 hours on this, Renata said. I'm sure. The room felt very still. The city outside did what the city always did, moved, indifferent, continuous. And she sat at her desk in the middle of all of it and tried to arrange what she was looking at into a shape she could use. Jeffrey had pushed her toward the Ashby Group. Jeffrey had been enthusiastic, more than enthusiastic. This is exactly the partnership you need, he told her over coffee 3 weeks ago. Ashby money changes the conversation. It legitimizes everything. And when the deal collapsed, when she'd read 4 sentences in a hallway, Jeffrey had come back into the empty conference room and sat across from her with his hands together in that gesture of performed thoughtfulness and said, "We'll find another way." He'd already arranged the other way. "Don't tell anyone," she said. "Already haven't. Not yet. I need to think," she thought all night. At 6:30 in the morning, she was at the coffee shop 2 blocks from her building, a small place with worn tile floors and a barista named Arturo who made her order without asking because she'd been coming in for 2 years and always got the same thing. She was at the window table with her second cup and a legal pad full of handwriting when the door opened. She knew before she looked up. She didn't know how she knew. Maybe it was something in the way the room adjusted, that same quiet recalibration she'd felt on the 15th floor 3 days ago. Or maybe it was just what her brain had been doing for 72 hours, assembling a person from fragments until the image was clear enough to recognize. Jonah Ashby walked in carrying a paper coffee cup and crossed to a small table near the back where a girl was already sitting. She looked to be about 9 or 10, dark-haired, wearing a jacket a size too big, with a sketchbook open in front of her that she was drawing in with the absolute focus of someone who had no interest in the world outside her page. He set his cup down, said something low. The girl glanced up, said something back, and immediately returned to the sketchbook. He sat across from her and opened a laptop without looking around the room. Anneliese looked at her legal pad. She looked at it for approximately 90 seconds. Then she got up. She walked to their table. She stood there until he looked up. 4 seconds, maybe 5. When he did, his expression was the same one she'd seen across a ruined conference room, unhurried, attentive, not unkind. "I owe you an apology," she said. She hadn't planned the phrasing, not a professional one, a real one. "What happened in that room was wrong because I wasn't paying attention to the things that actually mattered. I was looking at the clock and I turned away, and I should have stopped." Something moved through his face, not surprise, not warmth, something more complicated than either. "Sit down," he said. She sat. The girl hadn't looked up, but her pencil had slowed. "This is Lily," he said. He said her name the way people say the names of things they'd protect before anything else. "Hi, Lily," Anneliese said. Lily didn't answer, but after a moment she tilted the sketchbook slightly toward her, just for a second. On the page was the coffee shop in miniature. The counter, the tables, Arturo behind the bar, the morning light coming through the front window. It was genuinely, strikingly good. "She draws everything she sees," Jonah said. Not apologetically, just stating a fact about the world. Anneliese looked at the girl bent over her page and felt the specific awkwardness of not knowing the right thing to say, so she said nothing, because sometimes silence was more honest than whatever you could find to fill it. She looked at Jonah. "I know what my firm needs," she said, "and I know what we lost." but I'm not here to pitch you again. She paused. There's something wrong inside my company, something bigger than a bad meeting, and I'm trying to determine how far it goes before I do something I can't undo. He watched her. Why tell me? He said. Because you've already left, she said. You have no stake in this, which means if you tell me what you know, you're telling me for the right reason. Silence. The coffee shop moved around them. Arturo called out an order. A chair scraped. Lily's pencil crossed the page. Jeffrey Strand, Jonah said. The name settled between them like something that had been waiting. He reached out to us, Jonah said, indirectly, through a contact named Ray Denton, who represents himself as a deal facilitator. The communication suggested that the partnership would include a side advisory arrangement for a firm connected to your board liaison, and that this was consistent with how your leadership approached outside partnerships. Anneliese was very still. When I arrived that morning, Jonah said, I wasn't only evaluating the pitch. You were evaluating whether what you'd been told was true, she said, and then I was asked to wait in reception. He said it without satisfaction. Just a fact. I understand. I don't think you understand all of it. He leaned forward slightly. What Strand communicated, if it's accurate, means he structured our involvement specifically to redirect it. The partnership was never going to close on the terms you presented. He intended to engineer a renegotiation at the last minute that served his interests, not your firm's. She looked at the table. She looked at him. Can you give me anything in writing? Not testimony. Just what you observed. What you do with it is your business, he said. I mean that exactly. It has to be your business first, not mine. She understood the line he was drawing and understood that it was right. Thank you, she said. He nodded once. Lily looked up then. She turned the sketchbook toward Anneliese, just briefly, just enough to see the page. She'd added 2 figures to the coffee shop scene. 2 people at a window table, facing each other over their cups, both with the same quality of expression, serious, direct. Is that us? Anneliese said. Lily studied the drawing with her head tilted. You have the same face, she said. When you're thinking about something hard. Jonah made a sound that was almost a laugh. He turned it into something else, but not entirely successfully. Anneliese looked at the drawing for a moment longer, then she stood. She picked up her legal pad. I have work to do, she said. I know, he said. She walked out into the morning, cold and sharp and fully awake, and stood on the sidewalk for a moment before she started moving. 72 hours. She needed to move fast and she needed to move correctly. She started walking. By the time she'd gone 8 blocks and turned back toward the office, she had a list in her head, not written down. Some things needed to stay off paper for as long as possible. What she had: Renata's documentation of the Westbrook-Halloran-Jeffrey connection, Jonah's account of the Ray Denton approach, the timeline, Jeffrey pushing for the Ashby group, the deal collapsing, Westbrook appearing the very next morning like it had been sitting in a waiting room. What she needed: something that would survive a board vote. Something a lawyer couldn't dismantle in 20 minutes. She pushed through the building's lobby, nodded at the desk, and took the elevator to 15. Penn looked up when she walked past. You okay? Getting there, she said. Block my calendar from 11 to end of day. Tell anyone who asks I'm in an off-site. You're not going off-site. I know that. That's fine. She called their external legal counsel that afternoon, a woman named Constance Rye, who had been handling corporate litigation for 25 years with the particular manner of someone who had witnessed every variety of institutional bad behavior and had never once been surprised by it. Anneliese wrote 3 sentences in an email and asked for a call. She sent it. Constance picked up on the second ring 40 minutes later. I was expecting your call, Constance said. When a CEO emails me 3 sentences before noon, something's moving inside the company. Anneliese laid it out in 12 minutes. The structural elements, the chain of connections, the timeline. She didn't use Jeffrey's name. She said a senior board member, and Constance listened without interrupting. When she finished, the line was quiet. How solid is the financial documentation? Constance asked. My CFO built it. It's solid. The outside account. The principal who told you about the facilitator approach. Anything written? First-hand account. Nothing documented. Documented would be better. A pause. Can you get it? Anneliese thought about the coffee shop, about the line Jonah had drawn clearly and where it sat. I don't know, she said honestly. Don't push him, Constance said. But if he's willing, even an informal written account of what he observed, not a legal statement, that changes the weight of what you're bringing. She paused. Here's what I need you to do. Don't confront the board member. Don't move the financial records. Make sure your CFO has separate documented copies held outside the main system. Get me everything by end of business Friday. She paused. What you're describing is a breach of fiduciary duty at minimum. Possibly securities fraud, depending on what the Westbrook connection looks like on paper. Okay, Anneliese said. Who knows about this? My CFO. Me. The outside principal, but not what I've found internally. Keep it that way. Every person you add is a variable you can't control. A pause. You're doing the right thing by coming to me now. Call me Friday. Something loosened slightly in Anneliese's chest when she hung up. Not relief, too early for relief. More like the recognition that she wasn't walking through this alone. Renata had the compiled documentation on her desk by Friday morning. It was 89 pages, tabbed. Anneliese read through it that evening at her kitchen table with a highlighter and a pen, building the annotated version Constance would need. What emerged from those pages was not one thing but many, layered, advisory contracts awarded to vendors with quiet board connections. A deal from 18 months ago, a potential acquisition that would have been excellent for the firm, that had been quietly killed at the board level before it reached the full committee. Killed on Jeffrey's recommendation that the timing wasn't right. The target company had been picked up 7 months later by a firm that, if you followed the thread carefully enough, had a co-investment arrangement with an entity tied to Jeffrey's outside consulting group. He hadn't just sabotaged the Ashby partnership. He'd been working the firm from the inside for years. She went through it page by page, and she felt something that wasn't anger. Anger was too reactive, too hot for something this deliberate. What she felt was colder and more durable. The feeling of a decision solidifying. Constance arrived at 9 on Monday morning with her briefcase and the expression of someone who had already reviewed what Anneliese had sent over the weekend. She sat across the desk and laid it out with surgical precision. What they had was substantial. Not yet airtight, but significant enough to present to the board. What they still needed was either a documented account of the Ray Denton approach or additional records linking Jeffrey to the financial extractions across the full timeline. The outside principal, Constance said. Can he give you a written account of what he observed? Anneliese thought about the coffee shop. About the line Jonah had drawn. He hadn't said he wouldn't help. He'd said it had to be her business first. That she had to carry it to the point where carrying it was real. She thought she might have reached that point. I'll reach out, she said. No promises. She texted Kate Drummond that afternoon. She explained in 2 sentences that she wasn't asking for help with the partnership, and that she would clarify when they spoke. She put the phone down. It buzzed 4 minutes later. He'll call you in an hour. When Jonah called, she answered on the first ring. I've built the case, she said. I'm not asking you to be part of it. But Constance says a written account of the Denton approach, just what you observed, not a legal statement, would add significant weight. A pause. Constance Rye, he said. Yes. Something in his voice shifted, recognition, possibly something that was almost respect. I know her work, he said. She's good, I know. Another pause. The facilitator's name is Ray Denton, he said. I can give you a written account of the approach, the date, what was communicated, what was implied about who had authorized it. I'll have Kate send it to Constance by end of day tomorrow. Anneliese let herself breathe. Thank you. One condition, he said. What's the condition? You're the one who presents this to the board. Not Constance, not your CFO. You walk in there and you lay it down yourself. She almost said, of course. She stopped, because it wasn't of course, and he knew it, and she knew it. And saying of course would have been the easy version of what he was asking. I know, she said instead. I know it has to be me. The emergency board meeting was called for Wednesday at 10. Anneliese had submitted the formal request through proper legal channels Monday evening, citing the emergency disclosure provision, listing Renata and Constance as witnesses. By Tuesday morning, she had 6 confirmations. Jeffries came in at 11:15, later than all the others, which told her he'd spent time deciding whether to appear. He decided to appear. Absence would have told its own story. She rode the elevator from 14 to 15 alone at 9:58. She watched the numbers change and thought about nothing specific. She was past the thinking stage and into the doing stage, and the doing stage required a different part of her. The part that went quiet and moved forward. The conference room was the same room. The same river view, the same long table, the same east light coming through the windows. She set her documents at the head of the table and didn't move them. Jeffrey arrived at 10:02. He was wearing a navy suit and his customary ease, the practiced ease of someone who had been in enough rooms to know how to walk into them. He came in shaking hands, making brief contact with each board member, the warm competence moving ahead of him like something he'd sent in advance. He looked at her sitting at the head of the table with her documents in front of her, and something crossed his face, fast, nearly invisible, a brief recalibration. Then the ease came back. Anneliese, he said, settling into his chair. Unusual format for a Wednesday. Thank you for making the time, she said. She began the way Constance had outlined, the timeline first, the pattern before the name. She walked the board through the documentation with the precision of someone who had memorized every date, every number, every accessed file. She watched their faces as she moved through it, the audit committee chair's expression tightening, one of the independent directors leaning forward, the general counsel going very still in the way lawyers went still when they understood what they were looking at. She did not look at Jeffrey. Not yet. She walked through the advisory contracts. She presented the acquisition from 18 months ago, the one killed on Jeffrey's recommendation when the numbers were clearly viable, the one picked up 7 months later by a connected firm. She laid it out without adjectives. The timeline spoke. "I'd like to pause here," Jeffrey said. His voice was smooth and controlled. He had the voice of someone who had been using it as a tool for a long time. "I think there's context that's being left out, and I'd like to address." Under the emergency disclosure provision, Section 11, Clause 2 of the company's bylaws, Anneliese said without raising her voice, "An integrity disclosure by a sitting CEO may not be interrupted by motion until the disclosure is complete. I'd ask you to hold your response." She looked at him directly. "Thank you, Jeffrey." The room went quiet. She looked at him while she said it. She held his gaze for 3 seconds, exactly long enough to establish that she had no intention of looking away, and then she looked back at her documents and continued. She presented the Jonah Ashby account last. She introduced it as a written statement from an external principal, obtained voluntarily, describing the facilitator approach made to the Ashby Group prior to the partnership meeting. She did not say his name. The document was attributed to an external investment principal, which was sufficient for the board's purposes. She read 3 sections. The first named Ray Denton and described the approach. The second detailed what had been communicated about the proposed advisory arrangement and who had been identified as authorizing it. The third documented the date and the specific terms. Terms that had never appeared in any version of the partnership structure Anneliese had prepared or approved. She set the document down. She looked up at the room. The audit committee chair was looking at Jeffrey, so were both independent directors. The general counsel had stopped writing. Jeffrey looked at Anneliese. This was the moment. She recognized it as it arrived, the slight forward lean, the expression calibrating towards something that wanted to read as wounded reason. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her across conference tables and strategy sessions for 3 years. The look she'd always read as collegial, as the look of someone in her corner. She saw it clearly now. "These are serious allegations," Jeffrey said. His voice had lost some of its smoothness, just at the edges, "and I want to be clear that I take them seriously. But what we have here is a set of circumstantial connections and an account from an unnamed outside source, presented by a CEO who is understandably under significant strain following a failed partnership." He looked around the table. "What we owe this company is perspective." "Howard," Anneliese said. She was addressing the general counsel, still not looking away from Jeffrey. "Would you read the fiduciary duty provision from Section 9? Howard read it. It was 12 words with very little room. "Circumstantial connections demonstrating a pattern of conduct over 22 months, Anneliese said, "with documented evidence of financial benefit to connected parties, satisfy the burden for emergency review under that provision." She looked at the full table. "I'm not asking this board to reach a verdict. I'm asking you to authorize an independent audit of every advisory contract, every transaction, and every deal recommendation involving the board liaison over the past 3 years. That's the appropriate next step." She paused. "I'm also moving, under the emergency provision, that Jeffrey Strand recuse himself from all board activities pending the outcome of that audit." Silence. The particular silence that settles in a room after something has been said that can't be unsaid. Jeffrey put both hands flat on the table. "I have given 4 years to this firm," he said. 4 years, and I think this board, I think we've heard the disclosure." The voice came from the far end of the table. An independent director named Sylvester Okafor, 61 years old, who had been on the board since before Anneliese had taken the chair, and who almost never spoke first. He was looking at Jeffrey with an expression that was not angry, but was entirely without the warmth it had held in every prior interaction Anneliese had witnessed between them. "I think we should vote." Jeffrey looked at him. Sylvester looked back. Something collapsed in Jeffrey's face. Not dramatically. This wasn't a movie moment. There was no single visible instant of defeat. It was more like watching a load-bearing wall develop a crack that changed the whole structure without bringing it down. "I'd like to consult with counsel before any vote," Jeffrey said. "You're welcome to do that after," Sylvester said. "Constance, is the motion properly constituted?" Constance nodded. "It is, then let's vote." The vote took 6 minutes. The motion to authorize an independent audit passed 5-1. The motion for Jeffrey's recusal passed 5-1. The one vote against both motions was Jeffrey's own. He cast it looking straight ahead, his jaw set, the practiced ease entirely gone from his face, replaced by something that was neither anger nor defeat, but the particular expression of a person watching something they'd built over years be dismantled piece by someone they had not taken seriously enough. Jeffrey stood. He straightened his jacket. He looked at Anneliese. "You're making a mistake," he said, the voice under the voice, harder and smaller and less impressive than what he used for rooms. "I don't think I am," she said. He left. The door closed. She stood at the head of the table and let the room reconfigure itself around the absence of him. Shoulders came back from the table. The audit committee chair was already on her phone. Renata was writing quickly. Constance gathered documents with the focused efficiency of someone who had more work ahead and no time for the release of tension. Sylvester Okafor caught her eye from across the table. He didn't say anything. He gave her one slow nod, the kind that carried more than a sentence would. The kind that meant, "I saw what that cost. It was worth it." She nodded back. She stood at the head of the table until the room had mostly cleared. Then she sat down, because her knees were doing something she didn't want visible, and she put both hands flat on the table and she breathed. The city through the east windows was the same city it had been at 10. It would be the same city tonight. The continuity was, she found, actually helpful. Things this size happened and the city kept going, and the keeping going was not indifference. It was just scale. After Constance left, Renata stayed. She sat across from Anneliese with her compiled report in front of her and the expression of someone slightly emptied out and more tired than she'd been 2 hours ago. "It's going to go public," Renata said. "Probably by Friday. I know. Employees first. Before press, before investors." Anneliese looked at her. "The people inside this building find out from me before they read it somewhere else." Renata nodded. "Your father built this firm," she said quietly. "He'd have done it the same way." Anneliese looked at her. Renata wasn't a sentimental person, and she didn't say things like that casually. "Thank you," Anneliese said, "for all of it." She sat alone in the conference room after everyone had gone and looked at the chair Jeffrey had vacated, still pushed slightly out from the table at the angle a person left when they stood in a hurry. She thought about the corner chair, Jonah's empty chair, 2 weeks ago, the one nobody had mentioned directly, the one they'd all arranged themselves around. She picked up her phone and typed a text. She kept it short. "Board voted. Audit authorized. He's recused." She looked at it for a moment and then added, "I held the room." She sent it. She put the phone on the table and looked at the river through the east windows, the October light moving across the water in that particular late afternoon way that made everything look briefly honest. Her phone buzzed. She picked it up. 3 words from Jonah Ashby. "I know you did." She read it once. She looked at the river. She looked at the empty room. She had a company to run. She picked up her bag and walked out. 3 weeks later, she was in the coffee shop on a Saturday morning. The same worn tile, Arturo behind the counter, the same window table she'd been sitting at when everything had shifted. And Lily came in first, the way children entered spaces they already felt comfortable in, without announcement, moving directly to the table at the back, sliding into a chair, opening the sketchbook. Jonah came in a minute behind her. He ordered. He crossed to Anneliese's table. "You didn't have to come to mine," he said, sitting down. "We could have met somewhere else." "I like this place," she said. "It's where things started making sense." He looked at her with that same quality of attention, steady, unhurried, the kind that didn't announce itself but that she'd come to recognize as the most genuine form of it she'd encountered. They'd been meeting like this occasionally since the board vote. Not frequently, once a week, sometimes less. She sent him brief updates he didn't strictly need, and he always replied, usually with a question that was really a way of maintaining contact without performing it. It had settled into something she hadn't planned and didn't have an exact name for, which was maybe why it felt more real than most things that were carefully arranged. Lily appeared at their table without ceremony, sketchbook tucked under her arm. "I made a new one," she said, and placed the open sketchbook on the table between them. It was the conference room, the long table, the east windows, the river implied in the background. At the head of the table, one figure, standing, papers in front of her, the posture of someone who had decided. And at the far end of the room, near the door, another figure turned toward her, watching. Anneliese looked at it for a long moment. "When did you draw this?" she said. "Dad told me what happened," Lily said, with the matter-of-factness of a child who saw things plainly. "I wanted to draw the part where you won." Jonah looked at his coffee. The corner of his expression moved, that almost loss she'd seen once before, the one he didn't entirely manage to contain. "You didn't have to draw me winning," Anneliese said. Lily looked at her with the frank assessment she brought to all her subjects. You were already winning in the second one, she said. I could tell because your face was different. In the first drawing, you looked like you were waiting for something to happen to you. She tilted her head. In this one, you look like you're the one deciding. Anneliese looked at the drawing, at the figure at the head of the table, papers in front of her, standing in a room she'd cleared. That's a perceptive thing to notice, she said. I draw people, Lily said, as though this explained everything. It kind of did. Jonah met her eyes across the table. Something in his face had settled into a warmth that didn't announce itself, but that was plainly there, the kind that came from having seen someone under real pressure and knowing now what they were made of. She looked back at the drawing, at the two figures and the river light through the east windows, and the room that had, 6 weeks ago, been the hardest room she'd ever had to walk into. She thought about the man in work boots with a paper coffee cup being walked to the door while she looked at the clock. She thought about 4 sentences in a hallway and cold water over her wrists, and a legal pad full of handwriting, and 72 hours of building something in the dark. She thought about 5 words from Sylvester Okafor. I think we should vote. That had carried more weight than a longer speech would have. She thought about the feeling when Jeffrey Strand had stood and straightened his jacket and walked out of the room with nothing. And she thought about a girl who drew everything she saw, who had put a figure at the head of a table and titled the drawing in her own private way. The part where you won. Some rooms you walked out of the same as when you'd entered, and some rooms changed you, not by breaking you, but by requiring you to be the version of yourself that already existed, but hadn't yet been asked to stand up all the way. She'd walked into that room with something she'd built herself, with no one holding it with her, and she'd held it. That was the whole thing. Not the deal, not the audit, not Jeffrey Strand's recusal. The knowledge, earned in the only way it could be earned, that she could walk into the worst room and not disappear. She picked up her coffee. Outside, the October city moved in its ongoing way, indifferent and enormous and full of smaller, truer stories happening in the coffee shops and the conference rooms and the window tables inside it. She's right, Jonah said quietly. Anneliese looked at him. The face in the second drawing, he said. It's different. She looked at Lily, who had already moved back to her table and was drawing something new. The coffee shop this time, the counter, Arturo, the morning light. She looked at the window. She looked at the river, still there, still moving, patient and ordinary, and entirely indifferent to the fact that 3 weeks ago it had been the backdrop for the worst day of her professional life, and today it was just a river. I know, she said, and she did.